What is going on, Fantasy Fam? Welcome to the Week 11 edition of Plugged In. I'm not really your host. I'm only your host insofar as I greet you on this, but I am your host. I'm your guest with my co-host slash site owner slash guest, Scott Barrett. Scott, my man, it's been 2 weeks since we last hung out. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. You sound way better. I listened to one of your shows at the end of last week, and
Oh my God.
You were dying.
Yeah, and you know what? I sent a voice note to Aaron last Tuesday because I couldn't do the Winner Circle podcast either. And then he like cut a clip of it and put it on Discord so people could hear what I sounded like. Because last Tuesday, it was like I could whisper was my voice. I think I sent you a voice note too to be like, here's proof that I really can't do the show today. But yeah, I still like as of this morning was a little bit sick. It's been almost 2 weeks, but feeling much better and on the up and up. So there's that. How was the show last week, and how was your week last week? Did the show miss me? Was there mourning? Were there black flags, or was it just a celebration that I was not around?
Well, that was a rough week for you to miss because you nailed basically everything the week before.
I did.
Amazing, except you didn't have Joe Mixon, which is the one thing you needed to have. And I was kind of the same way. I had one lineup that didn't have Mixon, but would have finished like third or fourth among all non-Mixon teams. The show went well. We had Darren on from Discord, and he said basically, yeah, I'm only playing 4 quarterbacks this week: Justin Fields, Tua, Mahomes, Josh Allen, and those were the top 4 highest scoring quarterbacks. Although this was a week where it was sort of Fields or bust for tournaments. And then for my own lineups, I took a bye week. I finally took a bye week, and I needed it so badly, and I was so grateful for having taken that bye week. Yeah, there were some things I got right, some things I got wrong. It was an interesting week. The community, quote unquote community, was like, oh, this week stinks. This week is horrible. And I actually liked the week because, like, sure, it was difficult to build lineups you really love, but everyone else had that same problem, and there were
exactly
some cheap players I liked.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I like to talk about on those weeks is that if it's ugly for us, it's ugly for everyone. And so if we consider ourselves to be sharper DFS players in the field, that actually gives us an edge over the field. I'm really glad to hear you took that bye week. One of the easiest things when you're like, oh, I'm going to take a bye week is you get to Saturday and you get that burst of confidence of like, oh, but I actually do know everything on this slate. And then you end up playing. And what's so valuable, you talked about 2 weeks ago, like of the non-Mixon lineups, right? Like you and I were essentially the consolation prize winners of week 8. Was that week 8, week 9, where it was like out of all the rosters that didn't have Mixon, we basically finished first place in a lot of our contests. I actually had I was first place in the 100K SPY until Kenneth Walker's long touchdown run at the very end of that Seattle game on week 9. Like that was how good my rosters were minus Mixon. Was that I still almost got a first place finish. But you can kind of look at that and you're like, man, okay, like I played well. I didn't have this one guy. And one of the things you and I talked about that day was on Sunday of week 9 was like, this is a player who does this every year, right? He underperforms, and has a blow up game. And so you should have some exposure to him just in from a standpoint of like, hey, this guy can do this. But then so much of DFS is that confidence of, okay, I know that I'm on the right track. I know I can trust my decisions. I know I can pull the trigger on this. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. And I'm comfortable being wrong because I know that it was good process. And so kind of having a week like that where you're like, oh, I actually finished near the top of all the non-Mixon rosters, and then taking the week off, where again, like I said a couple weeks ago, after my week off, like having a week off, it kind of gives you a lot of confidence because you didn't have to put together the rosters, and you can just be like, oh, I actually do know all of this stuff. And so I feel like that can really lead to like a really nice follow-up week or follow-up set of weeks, which granted this week is uglier even than last week, mostly because of DraftKings pricing getting super tight and then the slate being kind of ugly on top of that. But we'll get to that deeper into the show. But yeah, I mean, I think that's it's so beneficial. And even for anybody playing, like in listening to this and you're like, oh yeah, I'm kind of in a rut. Taking a week off is so valuable, but like taking a week off and still putting in the time to prep for the slate and then just not build rosters, because it does give you kind of that boost of confidence. And honestly, there's one side where it's like, oh, but now I took a week off. I only have like X number of weeks left. But realistically, you can be playing lots of different slates. You can be playing the showdown slates. You can be playing flash drafts. You can be playing afternoon only slates. So you can still get a lot of slates in the last 7 weeks or whatever would be left after you take that week off. You got Thanksgiving slate coming up. So yeah, if you're in a rut, taking a week off but still like putting in the time is super valuable.
So how did you do this week? Just from listening to the Squirrel show you did, I have to imagine, even if you didn't smash, you had some amazing calls that I believe you need to victory lap. You were driving the Jonathan Taylor bandwagon. And
I was right there. I had the pedal to the metal on that one.
You really did. And one thing, I don't know if you brought it up or not, but it's something I thought about seriously, is when Jim Irsay decided to fire Frank Reich and hire Jeff Saturday. It came during that game 2 weeks ago where he called up his buddy Jeff and he was like, Jeff, our offensive line is broken. How do we fix it? Jeff Saturday went on a 30-minute monologue. They hung up the phone. Irsay thought for an hour and he's like, hey, do you want to be the head coach? And so like, you have to imagine like he had a good grasp on the situation. And then what did we see last week? The Colts ranked bottom 3 in PFF run blocking grade heading into the week. And then last week, it was their best week this entire season by pass block grade and second best by run block grade. They might have ranked first overall in like offensive line grade. So yeah, a big turnaround performance. And then no Nyheim Hines, no Deion Jackson. They said Matt Ryan would start, which, maybe they're actually trying to win games. They're not tanking. Like, of course, there were a million holes you can poke in it. Like, Jonathan Taylor's maybe not healthy. He hasn't played well all year. The offensive line is broken. This team may or may not be trying to win games, but, no one's going to play him. And you can make those upside arguments, and that's what you need to do in NFL GPPs.
Yeah, I think you described that perfectly. Like something where we can poke holes in an argument is what we want, right? Because, and even somebody like Squirrel, who's like, he wins so many qualifiers where it's first place or nothing because he's so willing to embrace those plays that other people aren't on. And so when we were on the show and he was like, I don't know about Jonathan Taylor, like I was like, well, that even further solidifies that I want to play this play, because if a guy like Squirrel is even like uncomfortable doing it, then it's like, oh, okay, well then this is a guy, we want to look for those signals. Like a lot of like guys like Blender, guys like Sonic, guys like Cubs Fan, one of the things that they do is listen to a lot of like public podcasts throughout the week, like Sirius XM, DFS podcasts, because then they can get a sense of like how the field is thinking, right? Like any places where we can find those signals where it's like, oh, okay, this guy really will be low owned, then that's valuable for us. And yeah, it's we have to be willing to be wrong on things in order to be right when nobody else is on a play. And so it's the same thing with Justin Fields, right? Like going out on a limb and saying like 2 weeks ago I was comparing playing Justin Fields like week in and week out to playing Josh Allen his rookie year in 2018 down the stretch, right? Like you got to go out on a limb and be willing to be wrong in order to say something like that, in order to put Justin Fields on like all of your rosters and all your high dollar rosters and stuff like that. So yeah, the Jonathan Taylor one, what was interesting about that was we typically see a team have like an interim coach bounce, but usually that's because they hate the coach who's being fired. And like by all accounts, Colts players love Frank Reich and love playing for him. But at the same time, you've got this new guy who's coming in, who's not coming in to be a tactician, who's coming in to be like a rah guy and get the troops fired up, right? Leadership, culture, that's what Jim Irsay was talking about. And so just to think like, well, how are they going to try to win this game? There is no backup running back. They're going to give Jonathan Taylor the ball. I actually got down, I put down 1.5 units on the Jonathan Taylor over for 17.5 carries as well. I didn't want to go like overboard and draw attention to myself on my sports betting account and potentially get limited down the road, but try to get some money down on the Jonathan Taylor over. Yeah, so I actually played on Yahoo last week, and Yahoo is interesting because Jonathan Taylor, his price tag was the equivalent of like 6K on DraftKings. So he was a little bit higher owned on there. But what was interesting about playing on Yahoo last week was Justin Fields and Tua were the equivalent of like 8.2K on DraftKings. Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes were the equivalent of about 10K on DraftKings. And Kenny Pickett was still the equivalent of 5K. So I had a ton of Kenny Pickett just because it was like, well, he's so cheap that, and so my thing last week, same thing, right? It was like, okay, the only quarterbacks who make sense are Tua, Josh Allen, especially once we could get him at low ownership because of all the uncertainty around him. Tua, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, and Justin Fields. And then it was like, okay, if you're going to go cheaper, you have to go to a guy who can hit for a huge score. Unfortunately, the game environment didn't develop for Kenny Pickett to where like he was attacking from behind. He was more attacking from ahead. So the points didn't pile up. But yeah, I had kind of like, in fact, actually was like negative 50% ROI, but I was break even until like the last 10 minutes of the late games. And then a couple things happened and knocked me down. Thankfully finished at profit overall on the week between parlays and prop bets and my DFS play. But yeah, it was, for me, it was Fields, Tua, Mahomes, Josh Allen, and then a lot of Kenny Pickett because on Yahoo, just the way the pricing worked out, he was so much less expensive. But I think on DraftKings, like it was so clear, like Fields and Tua were still underpriced, and there were so few other good quarterback plays on the slate. It just made a lot of sense to go that direction. And yeah, it's been an interesting NFL season. We've seen good offenses like kind of fall apart. You have these teams like the Rams, where maybe like week 4, week 5, where you can sit there and be like, oh, well, they're going to turn it around. They're the Rams. They're Sean McVay. Like we've seen year in and year out, whether Goff's the quarterback, Stafford's the quarterback, this team puts up points. And then eventually you have to be like, oh, okay, we have to change our perception of this team. The Cardinals have been like incapable of putting up points. The Rams have been incapable of putting up points. The Seahawks have had a good offense. The Lions have been kind of up and down, but had a good offense. The Packers are incapable of putting up points. And so, yeah, it's been an interesting year where we're constantly adjusting the way we're seeing these teams based on things that we've known for years about these teams. Sean McVay, Aaron Rodgers, Russell Wilson, right? And then we haven't really had a lot of other teams that have replaced those strong teams. So it's like the Rams are no longer a good offense to target. The Cardinals kind of up and down. The Packers are no longer a good offense to target. The Cowboys are a run-heavy offense now. And like as all of these offenses have disappointed, it's not like we've had a bunch of new offenses that have elevated. And it's like, oh, now these offenses have taken their place, right? Miami has, but that's really kind of it for the list of offenses that have ascended. Miami, sometimes Seattle. So yeah, it's made for a really interesting season where as pricing gets tighter and tighter, it's like it's just going to keep lowering the first place scores in tournaments because pricing is getting tighter, but offenses aren't getting better, right? And so yeah, it's been kind of a weird season, and we're in a weird situation, like a weird point in the year right now, where I'm excited to see what the next few weeks look like in terms of like where the edges are when pricing's getting this tight and no offenses are really that good.
Looking back on this week, I'm curious how I would have done. I don't think I would have profited. If you read the article and went in rank order, you would have said I did really well this week. I had Justin Fields as the top quarterback play, Christian Kirk, DPJ as top 3 wide receiver plays. Although Saturday, I never do this, and I did it Saturday. I edited the article and I swapped Olave and Kirk. I don't know. I have no idea why I did that. Still so mad about it. Running back, I had Pierce as like the top cash play, but I was like, listen, he's not a GPP play for 7 different reasons, and a lot of guys like that. But so I had Fields as the top play, but I said I'm personally going the Darren route, which is like what he recommended, is like equal exposure to Tua, Allen, and just like looking back on that, I think that was super wrong. Like it was just the smash spot. Like if you read that blurb, it's just like this is the worst defense against scrambling quarterbacks. They're also garbage against the pass. He pace is high. Like these should just smash. And so I think that was wrong. I wouldn't have had Komet, although I should have, because I'm always like, if you're going to play a quarterback, always make sure you stack him with the tight end. It's just like free upside at these cheap prices and things like that. But the thing that bothers me the most is 2 players I didn't talk about. One, I had Alan Lazard as the 8th best wide receiver play of the slate, and not as a GPP play. I thought like you could consider him for cash, and bad call by me. But I like Christian Watson wasn't even on my radar. And I said maybe 3 months ago on a podcast, Christian Watson's the kind of guy who keep in mind for DFS, because there's going to be like 2 games in the second half of the season where after 8 weeks of doing nothing, he drops 30 points. Like that's his upside. Freak athlete, great deep threat, whatever. wasn't even on my radar, had this massive game. The other one, and I think this was a function of me taking the bye week, was I said on our show, Paris Campbell. If Matt Ryan were the quarterback, I would have 100% exposure. It's not just the volume he's seeing with Matt Ryan, but like slot wide receivers versus the Raiders. This is one of the best and most profitable matchups I've seen in like 7 years. Like just keep hammering that nonstop. And then they announced that Matt Ryan was the starting quarterback. I tweeted out, I'm like, you need 100% exposure. Late swap him in every lineup. He's going to score 22 fantasy points. And then someone tweeted at me as like, bro, the game's already started. I'm like, wow, I'm just like totally like on my bye week right now. One other thing like that too, where someone asked me in Discord, what are the best DFS plays? And I was like, Arizona on DraftKings and then like Saints on FanDuel. And then the guy was like, yeah, I just disagree with that. Like, I'm just going to go Arizona on both. They're playing against John Walford. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. I don't know why I said that. And so the bye week did affect me. Good news is like, that's my only bye week. I'm done, and hopefully batteries recharged. And, but yeah, any more macro thoughts on, maybe things you didn't see, but you should have seen or
yeah, I actually have a number of things. So I love the Damon Pierce thing. And what's interesting, what this is one of the reasons why, like, let's talk macro DFS theory, is why it's so important to have a sense of what's unique about each slate. And by the way, if you're watching this, you're a Fantasy Points subscriber, stay with Fantasy Points because it's awesome. But sign up for OWS free. You get the Angles email every week. And I basically break down like the macro view of the slate. And that hits your inbox every Thursday morning. It's free. It's part of OWS free. But this last week, what was interesting is we've had so much talk this year about chalk hitting. And one of the things that I've focused on is, yeah, chalk's hitting because it's good chalk, right? And we don't notice the times when bad chalk misses as much as we notice the times when good chalk hits. And so 2 weeks ago, one of the things that we talked about was there were 6 or 7 like really good running back plays. And a lot of them were underpriced, right? There was Austin Eckler was a really good running back play 2 weeks ago. But also we had Kenneth Walker in the 6K range. We had Joe Mixon in the 6K range, Ramondre Stevenson in the 6K range. Tony Pollard in the 6K range, whatever it was. Like so many different running backs in that 6K range that were all really good plays. And so one of the things you have to recognize is if I'm fading these guys and going to somebody else, I would need all of them to miss, right? Like it doesn't help if 2 of these guys miss because all of these guys are going to be high owned. And so if 2 or 3 of these guys do hit and you don't have them, now you're still chasing the people who rostered those guys. And so when there's good chalk, we want to side with that good chalk because especially when there's like a plethora of good chalk, there you can only roster up to 3 running backs. But there's like 6 or 7 good running back plays. Well, you've got to play some of those guys. Otherwise, you're just going to fall behind the field because they're not all going to miss. Last week, what was so interesting was it was one of those weeks that I often bring up where like chalk forms no matter what. And when you can find these weeks where chalk is chalk just because chalk becomes chalk, where it's a guy who would be overlooked on a different week. So I brought up a lot last week, the Damon Pierce, if it had been the week before when we had Kenneth Walker and we had Joe Mixon, we had Ramondre Stevenson, we had all these guys in the 6K range, nobody would have been playing Damon Pierce that week, right? At 6.3K or whatever he was. Everybody would have been avoiding him. So that's the kind of chalk that you want to just stay far away from in tournaments. That's not to say that he can't hit. It's just to say that like his chances of hitting are a lot lower than the typical chalk. And same thing last week with Greg Dulcich or however we're saying his name. Like totally fine play on paper, right? But if he's going to be 20% owned, it's easy to say, okay, well, if this guy were low owned, then that's a guy I might want to go to. If this guy's going to be on all these rosters, let me just hope that this chalk misses. Be aware that it can hit, but this is the place where you can find your edges. So I thought that was super sharp on your end about the Damon Pierce thing. Like you play him in cash and avoid him. Go ahead.
Yeah. So just on Dulcich,
I gotta blow my nose anyway. I'm getting off screen.
All right. So I love the Dulcich play just because he was averaging 2 deep targets per game over his prior 2 games. Russell Wilson, we know that's his calling card and bread and butter. And I saw all this hype for Foster Moreau and Harrison Bryant. And I'm like, yeah, but like Dulcich has like the incomparable upside based on this use. So that one really killed me. Damian Pierce, I thought that was bad chalk on multiple levels. So as what you said, like, listen, the chalk we've been getting at the running back position has been amazing. Pierce is like a good play. He's not amazing. And so I said the exact same thing in the live stream, which I just took from you the prior 2 weeks, because you've been saying that for a while, or to be cognizant of that. But it also didn't work because he has one game over 20.3 DraftKings fantasy points all year. And then just like as a Giant, he's game script dependent. And then as a Giants fan, they're bad against the run on the whole. Like, they rank second worst in yards per carry. But when they face these like teams that run their offense through the running back, they sell out to stop the run. They have Jihad Ward playing significantly more snaps, and he's really good against the run. And so they shut down Derrick Henry. They shut down Khalil Herbert when David Montgomery was out. They shut down Aaron Jones, Kenneth Walker, and now Pierce. All those running backs fell under 12.5 fantasy points, 3.85 combined yards per carry. So, like, it just looked to me like bad chalk on every single level. And there were a few guys like that this past week. But that's what happens when, pricing is so tight. It kind of forces you into.
Yeah. Yeah, that was what was interesting. It was like, if you wanted to reach the high priced wide receivers last week, you almost had to play Pierce, right? He was going to be like forced into your build if you're hand building, if you're using an optimizer, because it's like, well, where else are you going to go where you can project the touches and you can project the usage, you can project the fantasy scoring. And so you almost had to go to the place where you couldn't project it, right? And so like that was why like anybody who played Jeff Wilson last week, or even Raheem Mostert, right? But even just anybody who played Khalil Herbert, even though it didn't work out, Khalil Herbert was great leverage off of Justin Fields. He could break some long runs, he could score touchdowns. And so finding these guys like below 6K, where it was like, yeah, these are lesser plays on paper, but this allows me to get up to these high-priced wide receivers. This allows me to do something different with my roster. It was just a great GPP week last week, and like more so than some other weeks, because the quarterback was very clear. It was like, hey, these are the best guys. And you said that about Fields, like, oh, I would have probably split my exposure among these guys, and I should have just gone 100% Fields. But really, like, we can also draw up the picture of Fields going for 23 points. If that game doesn't stay close, basically, he ends up scoring like 22, 23 points, even though it's a great matchup. And so, like, I feel like even splitting up the exposure was a totally fine way to go if you'd gone that way. And but yeah, it was a really nice GPP week. I do want to hit on some of these like sort of situations that we saw last week, and kind of talk individual teams, individual players. One spot is Rachaad White taking over this running back role in Tampa. Got the start, got more touches, more yards before Leonard Fournette got hurt. Any thoughts on that spot?
Yeah, Jeremy Fowler tweeted out the day before that the team loves him. They're going to force him into a larger role. They're really excited about it. They need to shake up this running game. And then Leonard Fournette also got hurt during the game. And then today, Greg Allman, their best beat writer, said he thinks he's going to remain the starter. It depends on how much of a committee this is, because they could just be like, a 55-45 committee where they're cannibalizing each other's production and it's not worth getting excited about. But they could just say, hey, if he does well and continues to see an increase in usage, he could be a bell cow. Like, we've seen how valuable that role can be. Granted, this isn't the same hyper-productive Tampa Bay offense. I would have liked to see more passing down usage like that was, but during the post-draft presser, the vibe I got was, okay, it's the Lenny's show for 2023, but then this guy is a full-on bell cow in 2024. They were like a three-down running back who's great as a ball carrier, who can pass block, and is just as good, if not better, as a pass catcher. That's rare, and that's something we covet more than any other team. We really value that skill set, and Rachaad White has it for days. I really like Rachaad White. He popped in all of my prospect model stuff. He's a high-end athlete, ridiculously talented pass catcher. So I see big upside, especially for a quarterback who historically targets running backs more than maybe any other quarterback in NFL history minus Drew Brees.
Yeah, it seemed like Lenny is a Tom Brady decision. And it's
Yeah.
like Brady's always talking about how much he likes Leonard Fournette and how important Leonard Fournette is to the offense. And it's crazy because you watch Leonard Fournette and you're like, oh, could I beat this guy in a race? Like, is there anybody slower than this guy in the NFL?
Yeah.
And he's like, he's plodding. He doesn't have quickness. He doesn't have twitch. But he, and really, he's not even a Brady type guy in that, oh, he just comes to like lunch pail guy, comes to work, does his job. Like half the time Fournette seems disinterested, but he's been able to fill in this role. And it was like Fournette or Ronald Jones for a while, right? So Brady kind of fell in love with Fournette. So I was excited to see Rachaad White kind of get those touches. And I'm always looking for those situations where the split starts small, but it could start moving bigger and bigger throughout the season. Another one that was interesting this last week was Jaylen Warren. Obviously, there was talk throughout the week about like Najee Harris was going to like get his role cut into. And then it was weird as we were getting closer to Sunday where Warren had said that he hadn't seen any more first team reps in practice that week. And Matt Canada, Steelers offensive coordinator, came out and said that Najee Harris like looked like he was ready to turn a corner. So Najee Harris still got a lot of touches and Jaylen Warren got a lot of touches, but it was a kind of a rare game where the Steelers controlled things start to finish. So any thoughts on that? Do you think that's something where Warren's role will grow, or do you think this is just like an unusable backfield for now?
Yeah. Also, Mark Cabali, their best beat writer, like as soon as that was happening, was just like, "This is BS. Where did this come from?" And so that made me more confident in Najee. He had a great game, but like we did see a closer committee split. I thought, I guess I have to go back and look at, if there were any garbage time splits or anything like that. But yeah, I mean, I'm not bullish because I don't see Najee getting that rare 95% snap share role he had last season. And this is also a gross offense with a putrid offensive line, a bad offensive play caller, a quarterback who can't get first downs. The price can keep dropping, but this doesn't look to me like someone I'm excited to play. What do you think?
Well, and that's one of the crazy things is we're getting to this point where the running backs who are worth playing are all 7K and above. And so we almost have to be willing to go to these split backfields. But then, like, I'd rather go David Montgomery or Khalil Herbert in a split backfield than Najee Harris, right? Because Najee Harris, like, his value has always been that he gets a lot of touches. And with those touches, just points pile up. Whereas a guy like Khalil Herbert in particular, we know that he can break off a 50, 60-yard run and, pick up some of those points for you right there. If he gets a 60-yard touchdown run, that's 12 points. And Najee Harris might not be able to crack that in a whole game of like 15 plus touches. And yet these split backfields have to be something that we're a little bit more willing to go to. Because I think that what's going to happen is people are so used to finding certainty at the running back position that what they're going to do is they're going to keep paying up at running back and then taking on their uncertainty at wide receiver, right? Because wide receiver is more volatile anyway. So then they can feel comfortable like, hey, maybe this 5K guy can outscore the 9K guys. And that is like on paper, by the book, that's the best way to build rosters. That's the optimal way to build rosters. But in tournaments, we have to sometimes go a little bit less than optimal to do something different in the field to find that path to first place. And so it's one of these weird situations where finding some of these split backfields where it's like, yeah, but there is upside here. And then that allows us to get to some lower owned high cost wide receivers or get two of these high cost wide receivers where other people are getting one. I think that makes it a little bit interesting to dig into these spots. Like another one of the spots is the Packers. I've had a ton of success this year doing second half parlays on Underdog and taking like 3 players from one game in a second half parlay because you have so much information about the game to that point already. And Aaron Rodgers' second half parlay was 17 and a half pass attempts. And it was just like, I went like 2 of my normal units on that one because it was like, okay, there's no way that Aaron Rodgers is going to be asked to throw the ball 17 and a half times. This team is just saying like, hey, we can win on the ground, right? And that game went into overtime and he still didn't pass those 17 and a half like post halftime pass attempts. So that's another one that's interesting to me is this backfield where it's almost like we've seen teams do this against the Bills, right? Where they're like, we're not even going to try to pass. We'll just run the ball. And it's almost like the Packers are treating every game like they're playing the Bills. And they're just like, okay, we don't have weapons. We're not going to pass. We're just going to run the ball. They're on Thursday night this week, so we get a little bit more information before they're on the main slate. Again, we get to see if they start utilizing Christian Watson a little bit more. I love what you said about Christian Watson even though you didn't have him written up this last week. It's funny. He was a guy who, when I was looking at value, I came across his name several times, and I was like, man, he could hit. And I was like, nah, like I'm not bringing up that guy. But yeah, it's like it almost feels like this offense is gonna, like, literally, they're gonna be in position where it's like 35 touches between Aaron Jones and AJ Dillon moving forward. Any thoughts on that one? Again, just saying, like, hey, if these guys are priced in the 6K range, even though they're splitting the work, like, we need to be able to find some cheaper running backs who can go for ceiling. Any thoughts on those guys?
Yeah, Aaron Jones, like I'm pretty bullish on. Not only is he significantly better than AJ Dillon, like what are we doing here? Why is AJ Dillon still eating into his workload? But he's like one of the best, most efficient running backs in fantasy over the last 5 years, but also this year. It's one of these things where, okay, so his positional XFP market share isn't that high. It's like 65%, let's say. But the percentage of the team's XFP is very high because they just like run the offense through the running backs, that it can come out to being like a high amount of expected fantasy points and then really good efficiency on that because we know he's good. But it's also like in recent weeks, we've seen him get more and more work. I think he started out week 1 with like 45% of the work and then 48% and 53%. And a couple games the past 5 weeks, he's been over 80%. I'll have to check and see where he was at last week. But just like fundamentally, I think it is right. It's like you can go chalkier at running back. It's pretty predictive, and it's been insanely predictive this year. And this year, I think one of the holes in my game is not being more bullish about these super cheap wide receivers. Like this week, it was Christian Watson, Nick Westbrook, Akina, Paris Campbell, Donovan Peoples-Jones. I think there was another one in there. It's just like tough to play these guys or get excited about them. But I mean, the asymmetric upside that you're not going to find at the running back position, you're probably not going to find it at the tight end position. You're just, praying for a 2-touchdown game. We had some of that last week and the week before, but that's typically pretty rare. And then quarterback has been like just as predicted. Like I've had the number one, like that's like the most important for tournaments. We're seeing this year where it's like the top scoring quarterback of the week is in 90% of the top 100 lineups in the Millie Maker. And that guy's been in my pool like every single week.
Yeah. And these, one another thing we see is these like high priced quarterbacks are really underpriced, like in terms of their point per dollar production. And yeah, you bring up those cheap wide receivers. I've started including that in the player grid each week, which is my player pool in the scroll, is just like a header of cheap wide receivers with upside, because we're in that point in the season where pricing's tight enough. Like if you ask an optimizer to put in the optimal lineup for you, what it's like last week, it was Damon Pierce, Derrick Henry or Saquon Barkley, Tyreek Hill, and then a cheap wide receiver. Like every time that you ran the opto, it was forcing in a cheap wide receiver because it was like, hey, look, we can't project the points on these guys, but we can project the points on all these high-priced guys. And we know that this guy can have upside and can allow you to access these high-priced guys. And so the Donovan Peoples-Joneses, the Paris Campbells, it's funny, Paris Campbell is a guy I've been driving the bandwagon on for like 3 years now. And I still, every year I take like 50% of him in best ball. So that's been nice this year. But finally, like after week 3 of this year, I was finally like, you know what, I'm done with Paris Campbell. And now, each of his last 3 games with Matt Ryan, he's just like hit. But yeah, finding that willingness to say, and we talked about this on the show, but like the Tyquan Thorntons or the Donovan Peoples-Joneses, the guys who are just on the field all the time. And so even though their role isn't what you want, like it's better to go there, better on paper, better by projections to go there than to go to like a bunch of 5K wide receivers, because realistically, these cheaper guys, like the price tags are arbitrary. Like these cheaper guys can still hit for 20 points. They're just going to hit for 20 points less often than the 5K guys. But if it allows you to get Tyreek Hill, if it allows you to get Stephon Diggs, Justin Jefferson, whatever, you get a big edge there. I was actually surprised at Justin Jefferson's low ownership this last week. I thought that was an interesting one.
You were surprised? You're the one who hammers avoid receivers.
Oh yeah, don't play. Yeah, I broke that rule this last week. I had like 20% Justin Jefferson this last week.
That's amazing.
And I had Justin Jefferson and Gabe Davis, Justin Jefferson and Stephon Diggs, Justin Jefferson naked. Yeah,
I
I
thought
mean,
Gabe Davis was a great play. He seemed like Waddle to me, who was already like too low owned, but with more upside.
yeah, one of the guys it was Hilo or Mike likened Gabe Davis to Will Fuller. Like Gabe Davis
Right.
is the
That's a
new
great
Will
call.
Fuller in that he's going to miss hard when he misses, but he can hit for such a high ceiling that when he's low owned, and what was great this last week was all the uncertainty around who would be playing quarterback, and so just nobody was thinking about Gabe Davis. He didn't hit big, but it was still, I mean, it was nice to see him get some production, and he's kind of one of those guys who can always like be a difference maker in tournaments, and he's in that price range where he kind of opens up some other stuff. He's not cheap, but he opens up some other stuff. Waddle's kind of the same way, like opens up some other stuff, comes in with low ownership, can break the slate, and those are guys that we want to be looking at for sure. Okay, another.
Gabe was 7 yards short of 25 DraftKings fantasy points. He had a good game.
Yeah,
I wanted to commend you on one more thing. I just like blatantly stole this for you, but I was really trying to poke holes in the chalk, and I was not on Derrick Henry for tournaments, in part because like, okay, Denver's a run funnel defense on paper, but like this is already a run funnel offense. They're still like not really bad against the run, but it was more so this, which I just blatantly stole from you. Since he entered the league in 2016, he has 15 career games with 29 DraftKings fantasy points. That's 2 less than Alvin Kamara, 2 more than Dalvin Cook, despite having a 14 or 30 game advantage. And then a whopping 8 of those 15 games have only come against 2 teams, the Texans
Houston and Jacksonville
and the Jaguars. And this matchup is favorable, but it wasn't 2019 and 2021 Jaguars tech. What an amazing stat from you. So I have to out myself for stealing that. But I mean, yeah, once you consider his upside, which is like what you really need to be focusing in on within that context, it's like, yeah, this is not a good play.
Yeah, and it's like it's one of those things where, and I even played some of him this last week, even though I didn't like the play. It was a weird thing playing on Yahoo because the pricing, like guys like Jonathan Taylor were cheap. Michael Pittman was the equivalent of 3.5K in DraftKings salary. So I ended up on some of these cheaper guys who open up a lot, and then it's like, well, where do I spend this salary? And so I mixed in some Derrick Henry. I mixed in some who else was it? There was another high price wide receiver I didn't really love that I mixed in, but mostly I was focused on Saquon, focused on Diggs, focused on Jefferson. But yeah, the to just play this guy because what was great is he was popping in the optimizers too. So he's going to be popular because so many people are just like, okay, well, I play NBA every day. I come in on Saturday. Okay, the optimizer says this. Let me set my rules. Let me change a few things. But it's like, what's his ceiling really? We know that the Titans are going to run the ball. The opposing defense knows that they're going to run the ball. So even though the Broncos are way better against the pass than against the run, what are the Broncos going to think about all week? They're going to be like, well, all we got to do is stop Derrick Henry. Let's sell out to stop Derrick Henry. And yeah, like you brought up, I mean, most of our perception of him has been built around these games against the Texans, these games against the Jags, and not to say he can't hit in other spots, but he rarely does. And these like 50 pointers or 48 pointers or 42 pointers, whatever, like they've almost all come against those two teams. It's just not the type of thing that he does in tough matchups because he's a yardage and touchdown back. It would be really difficult to go for 200 plus rushing yards and 3 rushing touchdowns against like a non-bad defense. It just doesn't happen in the NFL. Okay, one other spot I wanted to bring up to you, the 49ers. I almost feel like we should have seen this coming, right? Like Elijah Mitchell's really good. Maybe like the general public shouldn't have seen it coming because I don't think the general public values Elijah Mitchell. And that's part of the perception of him was here's this low draft pick who came in and had a really good season last year, but then he was also hurt some. And so people kind of looked at it as like, oh, this fluky thing, right? We were able to get him in the 5th, 6th round of best ball drafts this year. Nobody played him week 1 when I was like super heavy on him. He got hurt that week and then hasn't been back. But I feel like we should have seen this coming that like, oh, the 49ers actually really like Elijah Mitchell. Why not keep Christian McCaffrey's body healthy and use both of these guys? But we're in a really interesting situation. Like Christian McCaffrey's price is going to come down slowly. That's how this happens. And so now he's going to be this high-priced guy in a split backfield. We don't know anything yet, but given what we do, like given the context clues that we have, what we know about Kyle Shanahan, what we saw this last week, Do you think that that's going to be something where, oh, next week Christian McCaffrey gets 80% of the snaps, or do you think this is something that we have to be wary of moving forward in DFS?
The Kyle Shanahan offense is all about the scheme, all about this outside zone scheme that his father ran successfully for decades. And Kyle is just continually spending high draft capital on running backs. These guys stink. And instead, like these random UDFAs are the ones crushing in this outside zone scheme. Christian McCaffrey is not good at outside zone historically. Looking at his numbers, his yards per carry is like 3.5 outside zone, 5.8 in man, right? So like I was worried about this fit. Elijah Mitchell, we know, is really good at outside zone. The good thing about Christian McCaffrey is when he was coming out, if he was like, I refuse to play running back, I'm a slot wide receiver, he would have went in late round one. Like he has that. That's more valuable. He was also getting all the near end zone looks, which carries outside of the red zone are borderline worthless. Saquon Barkley had 35 carries last week. Christian McCaffrey still had significantly more XFP. So there is a really good chance that CMC is just vintage Austin Eckler, vintage Alvin Kamara, where he's not a bell cow. He's ceding 50% of the carries to Elijah or Mark Ingram in that role, but still dominating snaps and like passing down usage. But then again, it could also just be the matchup. The Chargers rank dead last in yards per carry. So I wouldn't be surprised if this was just very matchup focused against one of the worst run defenses in football. And what we see moving forward is more of a 70-30 split in CMC's favor and maybe a more pass heavy approach as well.
That's very interesting. Yeah, that's another team that is not on the main slate this next week, same as the Packers. So it's like, you know, from a standpoint of the main slate, we actually get to collect a little bit more information. Although realistically, uncertainty is great for us in DFS because other people like to wait on information and we can kind of embrace that uncertainty ourselves. But, you know, I think my biggest concern with CMC is you also have Debo, you also have Kittle, you also have Ayuk, and like these guys have to get some touches too. And so it's going to be hard for CMC to get 8, 10, 12 targets when typically they're going to throw the ball 30 or fewer times with Jimmy Garoppolo under center and like with the way that they run this offense. I look at it as like this is like a dream team offense, but it's horrible for fantasy because the price tags on these guys are so high, and yet there's not enough ball to go around on this offense. But it's going to be interesting because I do think you're right. Like there's going to be spiked weeks from all these guys. There's going to be spiked games from Christian McCaffrey. That's really interesting about him having more XFP than Saquon Barkley last week. And that shows the power of targets, the power of touches close to the end zone. And even like, that was one of the things last week that was so challenging for me in picking running backs was it was like, who among these guys are going to score 2 touchdowns, right? Like the Giants weren't going to put Saquon in position to score 2 touchdowns. The Titans weren't going to be in position for Henry to score 2 touchdowns. The Saints weren't going to be in position for Kamara to score 2 touchdowns. And touchdowns are so valuable in fantasy. And that's one of the interesting things about Christian McCaffrey's on this 49ers team that, yes, he's going to be splitting the work a little bit more than some of these other guys, but the 49ers are also probably going to be scoring more points than some of these other – the offense some of these other guys are on. Which has value in itself. And so, yeah, I do think that this will be an interesting team that stimulates some thoughts for me, what you said there, because it's less predictable. His down games are going to be farther down, but like Debo's still going to have a huge game at some point down the stretch. CMC is going to have a huge game at some point down the stretch. Potentially Kittle's going to have a huge game at some point down the stretch. It's almost like you can mix and match these guys in tournaments because they'll be low owned. And if you get the guy who hits, you're in great shape. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would just say I'm really worried about Debo, at least in redraft. In DFS, sure, like he's going to have some slate-breaking games, but we heard this buzz all offseason, like, oh, Brandon Ayuk might be the new wide receiver 1. He's having an insane camp. And then just talking to my old PFF buddies who, are watching every single play 10 times, multiple of them have told me Brandon Ayuk looks incredible. Like he looks like one of the 10 best wide receivers in football. Debo looks different. He looks, there were rumors of him being out of shape in August even, in September even, and he just kind of doesn't look as dominant. But Ayuk's incredible. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there's already been a changing of the guard there, at least in terms of volume.
Man, those are bold words. I love it.
Because, I mean, a lot of what he does seems a little redundant to CMC. You know, the short area targets, the yards after the catch, and also the wide back roll. So there's all that. But, yeah, maybe it's a hot take. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's great. And I think that in terms of like pure wide receiver, it's probably accurate. What's interesting is Ayuk was in the doghouse for so long last year, specifically because of his inability to practice well and his inability to like be a professional. And it was like he got the message. I remember reading this offseason about him and Fred Warner getting in a fight one day at training camp. And it was like almost like Ayuk had become the leader of the offense, and Fred Warner was the leader of the defense. And yeah, I mean it's interesting, and I mean that team has an embarrassment of riches outside of the quarterback position. But between Shanahan's play calling and scheme and design, and then the weapons that he has, they can get yards with the ball in their hands. Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm with you on redraft. Like I think if you could unload Debo for anything viable at this point, it'd be great to do that, because other people can be waiting around saying like, oh yeah, but he's going to have a big game. But in DFS, it does feel like one of those guys who can still hit. It's almost like Devontae Smith, right? Nobody plays Devontae Smith because AJ Brown and Jalen Hurts and but realistically, he can get 6 catches and put up 140 yards. Like those random things happen, and you want to be there when they do. That's all I have from this last week. Do you have any other thoughts from this last week? And if not, I'm going to fire some thoughts at you for this next week.
Let's do it.
Okay. This is actually pretty crazy. For starters, the Bears are underdogs against the Falcons. It's on the road, but Bears against the Falcons, Justin Fields, right? We know that the Falcons have a horrible pass defense. We know that they're much better against the run than they are against the pass. Not that they're scary. They also have Dean Pease, who Dean Pease' signature is he has these complex defenses that is difficult for an opponent to face if the defense is working well, but it's easy for the opponent to face if it's too complex for the players to grasp. So one thought I have here is Dean Pease could say, hey, let's just go straight zone defense and make sure that Justin Fields doesn't rip us apart. Somehow teams don't do this often enough. They do it to Lamar Jackson these days. They're like, hey, let's just play zone. The Patriots didn't do it. The Patriots were like, hey, we'll play man coverage and whatever. But most teams they're just like, look, let's force this guy to dink and dunk his way down the field. Obviously, it's early in the week, but any thoughts on how the Falcons might approach that? Because obviously the field is going to be hyped up to play Justin Fields at I think he's 7.6K in salary at this point. Is this a spot where it's like, hey, maybe this is a down? I mean, it could be a down game for him, just natural state of play, right? He could throw for 200 yards, rush for 60, and not get a rushing touchdown, and all of a sudden he's not a smash play. But any thoughts on the matchup itself?
Yeah, there's also probably pace of play concerns, but just on paper, this is a top 3 passing matchup, a top 3 running matchup for Justin Fields. What he's doing is unprecedented. It's the most rushing yards by any quarterback through a 5-game span ever. Most design runs by any quarterback over the span by a landslide. He looks amazing. He looks incredible. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to make me overthink it. And I don't want to overthink it because Justin Fields was my Exodia quarterback. It's like this thing I've been doing for years where it's like must draft player at each position. And so this was the guy who was like, listen, he has Josh Allen upside, but he's priced as a low-end QB2. This is just a no-brainer must-draft pick. And I got mocked for that. I got trashed for that. And I was suicidal through the first 4 weeks of the season. But now we're here. He's had a string of amazing matchups. And this is just another amazing matchup on paper that I want to just, not overthink it and keep playing it. Because I've overthinked it before, when I was all in on Lamar Jackson or Jalen Hurts, by week 3 or week 4, I'm like, oh, well, he's chalky. But Dean Pease is someone I have a lot of respect for. He's a really sharp coach. And like you said, Vegas is sharp. So I don't know. I need to dedicate a little bit more time to that.
I like that answer. And I think that, this is one of those spots where ownership can kind of dictate our thoughts too. We can recognize that consistent 40-point DraftKings scores are just like not realistic. And so if everybody is going to him in the mid 7Ks, we can recognize that even in a bad, like if he's 20% owned, you can be like, well, I can play him, but still go underweight the field, right? But if people are kind of like, oh, well, now he's a little overpriced and Vegas only has him implied for 23 points on the road and he's like 6-7% owned, then it can be a spot where it's like, cool, I'll still play 10% of him, 15% of him. I'll also put him on my main build and take the upside. And I think that's probably how I'll approach things this week. But obviously, there's still time to let these things develop. Okay, we talked about cheap running backs and the willingness to go to cheap running backs in split backfields in order to have a different salary allocation, a different roster construction approach, maybe fit in two of these high-priced wide receivers where other people can't do that. This week, the Washington football team is playing the Texans. We saw Brian Robinson get, I think it was 26 carries last night. We saw Antonio Gibson add 14 carries on top of that. Brian Robinson is, I think he's 5.6K this week. He's shown no burst, no ability to break long plays. Even in softer matchups, he's not cracking 100 yards. But we have to think that he's going to get 20-plus carries here against the Houston Texans. If he goes for 100 yards and a touchdown, that's getting you about 20 points right there. That's a guy who's probably going to be low-owned and can help you kind of do some different things with your roster. Any top-of-head thoughts with that?
Yeah, I think he's a great play. I feel like you're going to tout Antonio Gibson, and Gibson's going to outscore him. Like on Friday, you're going to start touting Gibson, and Gibson does outscore him. But I think he's a great play for everything you just outlined. It's just like a perfect matchup, and the volume's going to be there. And he's cheap.
Yeah, and Antonio Gibson's another guy who's never really had big games. He had like a huge game on Thanksgiving in 2020. And even though it was a Thanksgiving slate and it was COVID year, there was no Thursday night game that week. So there were only 2 games on that slate. And Antonio Gibson was like 18% owned or something like that. And that was a game where he put up, like 40 plus points. And I think that was the week I faded Zeke, who was super popular, and played Antonio Gibson instead. And he put up like 40 plus points. But really, like his ceiling throughout the rest of his career has been about 20, 23 points, something like that. So I'm always a little hesitant to pull the trigger on him. But then realistically, at his price tag, I guess we'd be pretty happy with like 20 to 23 points, allowing us to do some different things in other spots.
You on Friday are going to be like, he hasn't had a big play all season, but we know from his past he can break off big plays at will. I'm like, this is the defense to do it against. So like first quarter, a 60 rushing yard touchdown, that's certainly possible. And then maybe he keeps getting more work ahead of Brian Robinson because this guy has no explosion, and then he wins you $1 million.
Those maybes can get you in trouble sometimes. Now I'm feeling pressured. Now I'm feeling pressure to go with those maybes on Friday this week just so that I can be like, yep, Scott, you were right.
You were on Raheem Mostert this week, so
I was on Raheem Mostert and Jeff Wilson. So that's okay. That's fair.
Hey, maybe play both.
Okay. Chiefs and Chargers are playing this week. Any top of head thoughts there? Interesting thing about the Chiefs is that it's kind of unpredictable where the points are coming from for the wide receivers. Kadarius Toney, our boy, is seeing a little bit more work there. Top of head thoughts, Chiefs and Chargers is going to be clearly like one of the games to target this next week. There's not a ton of high upside games outside of that one.
Yeah, that's one of those games that just makes me wish I was an MME guy because on both sides, it's hard to figure out who to stack the quarterbacks with. DeAndre Carter, is Keenan Allen going to play? Is he going to be on a snap count? Josh Palmer, people want to play Gerald Everett every single week for some reason. Austin Eckler. Austin Eckler is crazy to me. Like his rushing yards per game, he ranks like 30th. By receiving yards per game, he's barely above Alvin Kamara, but he's just destroying all running backs and fantasy points per game just on those receptions per game. And like that's important. That's something to factor in, but it's also a little game script based on game script. And then, like you said, with Kansas City, like is Kadarius just like the Mecole Hardman they always wanted? Kelsey, can he break the slate? Is he too expensive? Juju, is he finally healthy? He had like wide receiver 1 games and 3 straight before that injury. And so it's like, as a single entry builder, like how do you approach that?
Yeah, I love that we have so many questions on the game of the week because that kind of tends to drive ownership away from it a little bit, and that is a difficult thing when you're building one roster. I think I'm going with this MME approach here now that I've got my wow, nice sneeze. Now that I got my feet under me with optimizer stuff, which by the way, that I'm going to put that workshop together this week, so I'll send it to you when I have it ready. It's going to be deeper in the weekend, but yeah, I mean, I think it's a good week for MME just from a standpoint of that's clearly the top game. And then there's going to be so many question marks on it that it's going to drive some people away. And then we can just say, like, okay, let me take some losses on some rosters by trying to figure out where the wins are on this team. Also, coming into last week, Kansas City had faced the most running back targets, allowed the most running back receptions in the league. And so, now Austin Eckler, definitely an interesting spot there. Last question. Broncos are playing the Raiders this week. Only time we've seen the Broncos put up some points, and the only time we've seen Russell Wilson do anything was against the Raiders, but the Raiders also scored a bunch of points. And it's like the Nathaniel Hackett has basically been like, hey, look, we won't open up the offense unless the opponent forces us to. Super, super smart way to play things. Saw a stat the other day that if the Broncos had scored just 18 points in every game this season, they'd be 8-1. That means that they have been that incapable of scoring 18 points. But passing matchup against the Raiders, looks like Jerry Jeudy will probably be out. So that makes them more one-dimensional, but also concentrates targets on Dulcich and on Cortland Sutton. So any early week thoughts there on our dead friend, Russell Wilson?
Yeah, I've got almost nothing except, like I've been saying, slot wide receivers against the Raiders. So it's a shame that Judy's going to be out. Who is their? I haven't looked at it, but we probably know. Who would their slot replacement be? Would that be Kendall Hinton?
I have no idea. Wasn't Hamler hurt this last week? And like Hinton was getting snaps.
Should be Hamler. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. If Hamler is healthy and out there, yeah, that's one of those offenses that I've been like hands off enough that I can't say exactly what's been going on. You know who I really like is Montreal Washington, but he would be playing on the perimeter, so not the guy I would be going to. They need a new quarterback and a new coach before I want to go to Montreal Washington, apparently. Yeah, no, I like that call on the slot wide receiver thing. And if Hamler's healthy, I don't even recall if he's on IR.
Why do you like Montreal Washington?
I like Montreal Washington. There were a lot of good camp reports on him, like a guy who can hit for big plays and, a guy who could maybe step in and have one of those random big games that nobody's expecting.
The thing I know about you, like what you were famous for, at least early on, is you would always play like a wide receiver who's 3,400, no one was on, and then he would have 10 targets out of nowhere, and you were all over. Yeah, why wasn't he cash? And that's what you're famous for back in the day. So now I'm worried about Montreal Washington. His name.
Don't be worried about Montreal Washington. He's not going to step in and see that work. But no, yeah, finding those cheap wide receivers where the pricing psychology tells people like, oh, well, this guy's dangerous, and you're like Donovan Peoples-Jones was that way last week, right? I mean, this guy's seeing like 6-7 targets every game. He's seeing a 5K wide receiver's workload, and yet he's sitting down here at 4,200. So people are like, oh, this risky guy down here. It's like, no, he's not risky. Like, people just don't want to play this guy because of his price tag. Yeah, no, Montreal Washington is not one of those. Maybe Paris Campbell is one of those, but I left that bandwagon a while ago. So, okay, that's everything I have for this week. Scott, you got any final thoughts before we get out of here, or should I close this out?
Close it out.
All right. Thanks, as always, for hanging out. Scott, fun to hang out with you today. Sad that we missed last week. We will see you guys on Fantasy Points throughout the week. We'll see you on a one-week season. We will see you back here next week, and we'll see you at the top of the leaderboards this weekend.